collaborative, interdisciplinary project, which he will introduce to us now. So welcome, Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Rose, and I apologise if you can see me on the screen. I appear to have disappeared into a strange kind of cyber haze. That probably just reflects my state of mind, but it shouldn't be like that. But anyway, don't look at me, look at the screen. So look, yeah, this is a talk that arises from a much larger 3-year project, as the screen in front of you tells you, called Intergroup Dynamics in the 1831 Reform Riots. Project re-examining the behaviour of both crowds and the authorities during the unrest surrounding the passage of the 1832 Great Reform Act. We're funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, so thank you. And our team, other than myself, comprises Professor John Drury, a crowd psychologist at the University of Sussex, Dr. Roger Ball, UWE Research Fellow, and our administrator, Jane Askew. We're working on a number of place-based case studies, and the Bristol riots of 1831 is just one of them. So to business. Between lunchtime and sundown on Sunday, the 31st of October, 1831, crowds of Bristolians systematically broke into all 4 of Bristol's prisons. They set fire to 3 of them, and they released all the prisoners. First, Bridewell, then a small debtors' lockup just off Broad Street in Taylor's Court, and then the new jail on Cumberland Basin, and finally the Gloucestershire County Jail at Lawford's Gate, just Old Market. Now, in a wider sense, these events were a central feature of the 3-day sequence of events usually referred to as the Bristol Reform Riots. Grand-scale disturbances that began the day before with a protest against the Tory recorder, Sir Charles Wetherell, had arrived in Bristol to preside over the city's assize court. More specifically, then, against Wetherell's vocal opposition to the Whig government Reform Bill, a piece of proposed legislation booted out of the House of Lords 2 weeks earlier and signalling widespread public protests. The Reform Bill, very briefly, was about parliamentary reform. Chiefly, it proposed to do 3 main things, I guess we could say. It proposed to eradicate the so-called rotten boroughs, those constituencies with tiny numbers of voters and where elections were controlled by a few big Whig landowners. It proposed to balance the north-south divide by creating new constituencies in the industrial north. And it proposed to, perhaps the best known thing it proposed to do, to increase the number and social background of voters across the nation by awarding the franchise for the first time to male middle-class property owners. The parliamentary Tory party, of which Wetherell was a member, was fundamentally to it. Bristol wasn't the first or only town to respond to the rejection of the bill in the Lords. There'd already been serious rioting, in fact, at Nottingham, at Derby, and a number of smaller towns. In each place, the property of prominent anti-reformers had been targeted and attacked. The civil power had been overwhelmed, and in most cases, order was restored only through military intervention. But when crowds first gathered at Bristol on October the 29th, until the following day's attack on the prisons, the only buildings to have been targeted were the Mayor's Mansion House, up with a red ring round it, so you know where it is. That's assuming you can make sense of the map. A place where Wetherell had taken refuge, making it a target in its own right. And the Council House, ringed up there, as you see, which was the headquarters of the corporation, the city council, and its magistrates, those who had sanctioned the use first of an aggressive body of special constables in Queen Square in an attempt to disperse protesters outside the Mansion House there, and then of military force too, causing early fatalities. First, killing a man at an alley entrance off Wine Street there, where 2 more people were also wounded by military action. A second man died after being felled by a cavalryman's sabre that evening in High Street there. These deaths all occurred on the Saturday, but then a third man was shot dead on Sunday morning near College Green. Now, these were, by any account, unusually high casualty figures for a disturbance that had not actually yet got particularly out of hand. And they also show that trouble was not confined to one small area of the town. But all right, damage to the Mansion House was certainly extensive. Its windows, its doors, its shutters were destroyed, its furniture smashed, food and wine was carried off. The recorder had going to sit down to a sumptuous banquet. Not anymore. But so far, apart from food and drink, no buildings had actually been looted. No private houses or businesses had been attacked. So these were selective attacks, it's fair to say, on the institutions of local governance. And I make these points here because, although we tend to use riot in an unqualified manner quite often to describe wild, unmeasured, recklessly violent behavior, it's a very blunt term. It doesn't always help us to understand what on earth was actually going on. Now, it's true, of course, despite what I've just said, that the familiar iconography of riots, reproduced in any number of oil and watercolour sketches by local artists like this one, was predominantly incendiary. There were certainly fires, and on an increasing scale as the event went on. But the point is this: incendiarism only began with the attacks on the prisons. And I think that's important. And what I want to look at closely now is just the attack on the largest of the prison, the new jail. I want to isolate as a crowd action that marked an important turning point in the riot, escalating the action from a limited protest against Wetherell and his allies as outspoken opponents of the Reform Bill into something with seemingly wider objective. Well, the attack on the new jail was nothing if not audacious. An attack that was perhaps unlikely to succeed. And the ease with which it was overcome was unsurprisingly met with consternation in many quarters. As the Attorney General would put it afterwards, "You will agree, no doubt, with me, that when the mob was parading the town and getting the upper hand, one of the first objects should surely have been to secure the jails from attack." So, well, why was the new jail attacked? Why were all the prisoners, regardless of the crimes for which they had been jailed, both felons and debtors, released? What did breaking into the jail have to do with reform? Well, to begin with, we need to think about the new jail not just as a reform target, if you like, but as an institution and as a material intrusion into the topography of the city. And it was indeed still pretty new. Called the New Gaol, it was new. It was opened in 1820, so just 10 years or so earlier, at a cost of about £100,000. It's a major civic building project. And it was designed to accommodate up to 198 prisoners. It was the long overdue replacement for the city's Newgate Gaol, which you see here. Newgate Gaol on Narrow Wine Street was a cramped, crumbling and insecure structure dating from 1689, completely unsuitable as a prison in a modernising industrial city, many people felt. At Newgate, prisoners had lived, socialised and slept in communal areas. Nurseries for crime, some people thought. And apart from the use of a punishment dungeon known colloquially as the pit, reformatory discipline was, shall we say, minimal. The new jail, by contrast, was a modern detached radial prison, as you see in this plan, with 4 wings fanning out from the governor's house at the centre. The semi-panopticon format allowed prisoners locked at night into individual sleeping cells in those 4 radial wings there, to prevent the evils of association, as the Society for the Improvement of Discipline put it, and allowed them to be kept under constant and observed inspection as soon as they emerged from those cells in the morning. But here's don't get, don't take this picture too literally. There are some obvious errors with it, but it's basically a what do we call it? An imaginary architectural plan of what the new prison was supposed to look like, drawn before it was actually built. You'll notice there's no floating harbour around the back of it for a start, which is very, very odd. And to that we don't know. It took until 1824, actually, for that 20-foot high perimeter wall you see there to be completed. And somewhat ironically, that 20-foot high perimeter wall was built by the male felons themselves, behind which prison was intended to appear, and was certainly intended to be, impregnable. Complex to be proud of, according to one city guidebook. Quote, for health, convenience and excellent arrangement. It was a prison, it said, not to be equalled in all England, commanding extensive views of the surrounding country. Well, it does here. Quite how much of the surrounding country most prisoners could expect to see beyond the 20-foot high perimeter wall is perhaps a moot point. But the enthusiasm of the guidebooks for the place is quite unmistakable. It is built in a very strong manner, it was noted. And in stark contrast to Newgate, the prisoners are arranged in 10 different classes, each class being cut off from communication with the rest. Steel bridges between each wing and the governor's house centre ensured that prisoners never had to leave their allocated ward, even to attend thrice weekly divine services in the chapel, above the governor's house. Prisoners could socialise. You can see them. I think I put this particular plan up because you could those where those metal wall blocks in the central house actually were. So prisoners could socialise actually during the day, albeit, of course, they were divided by the rigorous penal class system. So some of them could socialise, others couldn't. Each class had an associated day room allotted to it and an airing yard, so indoor and outdoor places to be. And whether indoors or out, they were all, quote, compelled to wear a party-coloured dress if they could possibly escape, if they could possibly escape, would immediately cause them to be retaken. So we don't know exactly what the party-coloured dress at Bristol looked like, but it consisted of a uniform jacket, trousers, shirt, shoes and a cap. And I suspect it looked very much not unlike this. Kidwake was a prisoner in the Gloucester Penitentiary between about 1795 and 1803. This was produced as part of a campaign for his release. But you see he is there in his distinctive prison garb, which I'm sure that turnkeys at Gloucester also felt. If he ran out of the prison wearing that, he would immediately be spotted and recaptured. That was the plan, anyway. In stark contrast to the old regime at Newgate, labour was integral to confinement at the Bristol New Gaol. Male prisoners were set to work from 9 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening every day, either breaking stones for gravel or working on the treadmill. Women were tasked with mending clothes or shoes or blankets. Discipline was maintained by a range of additional punishments. Solitary confinement might be ordered for what was described as indecent behaviour, or bad conduct at chapel, or refusing to work. While more serious offences like robbing a fellow prisoner or stealing vegetables from the prison garden could earn you a whipping. Now, there was no silent system before 1840 at Bristol, but nevertheless, the prison inspectorate reported care is taken to prevent all unnecessary noise. Now, what I have just given you there is what I think we might call a rather colourless and institutional description of the new jail. But if we're going to understand what happened there in 1831, I think we're going to have to ask the more qualitative question: what did the jail signify to the labouring class men and women who lived within its shadow? How, bluntly, did it make them feel? It was, without a doubt, the largest public building in the city, a constant looming presence, unmistakable to anyone working on the floating harbour or looking out across it. You can see this contemporary illustration. There it is on the right-hand side behind its walls, looming out at you. And especially, in fact, if you happen to be working in the shipyards directly overlooking its rear. Now it's blurred. Behind the ship there, you can see the great shape of the prison, watching over the workers as they build their boat. But most especially, I think, it was an intrusion to anybody crossing the New Cut from Bedminster on Harford's Bridge, or Bedminster Bridge. I mean, the only way across the water, Bedminster, really, to the town at that time. This is an illustration made from Harford's Bridge, looking straight at the prison. So if you went to work every day from Bedminster, that's certainly what you would see. And William Clark, one of those subsequently hanged for his part in the riots and a central figure in the firing of the jail, was himself a resident of Bedminster. The jail's blankly imposing perimeter walls, topped by 9-inch long steel spikes and stretching for 358 feet from east to west, beside the water there, enclosed a total area of 4 acres. Behind those walls, some 200 convicted Bristolians lived and worked, screened from sight every day. For one contemporary city guidebook, it was a sight to be savoured, for the boundary wall is built of hewn variegated marble from St. Vincent's Rocks, which has a beautiful appearance. I guess the reality of daily life for the men and women on the other side of the wall may have hindered their appreciation of beauty a little. For a start, relentless labour on the treadmill was dreaded. In 1831, the treadmill was still something of an innovation in English prisons, and it remained controversial. In essence, it was a simple solution to the growing problem of finding task work for the increasing number of prisoners ordered for hard labour. Teaching in abstract, I guess, the value of unproductive toil. Bristol Gaol had only a small treadmill when it first opened for pumping water, operable by just 2 prisoners at a time. In 1824, however, the city magistrates ordered a second, much larger machine capable of holding up to 20 prisoners simultaneously. Hours spent repeatedly climbing these steps to nowhere exacted a heavy toll on prisoners' mental and physical health. As one sceptical pamphlet put it at the time, it is on all hands allowed and in many instances boasted. The punishment of the treadwheel is an object of terror. In fact, it has added a hitherto unknown terror to the penal code. And let's not forget the introduction of the city gallows on a platform on top of the gatehouse roof. Public executions had previously been staged on top of St. Michael's Hill, more than a mile distant from the old jail at Newgate. But here, execution was institutionally integrated. So every stage in the punishment process, from whippings to isolation, from the treadmill to the gallows, were accompanied within a single purpose-built, self-perpetuating regime of social. All right, let's get back to the afternoon of Sunday, October the 30th, 1831. And we need to remember that the attack on the new jail had an important precursor. The crowd went first to visit Bridewell, Bristol's ancient house of correction and a very different kind of jail. Bridewell straddled a narrow lane bridging the River Froom. The governor housed on one side, the prisoners rather oddly accommodated on the other. You see on this little map here, where it says Bridewell in pink there, that's the prisoners' area, and just the other side of the lane there, that's the governor's house. The public, it's Bridewell Lane, public lane ran through there and went over the river. It could hold up to 56 men and women at a time, communally housed in large rooms, separated only by their gender. The majority of them unconvicted, but awaiting trial at quarter session. It was that kind of a holding cell, really, and together with a few temporarily housed vagrants, deserters. Well, attacking the Bridewell was a perfectly logical step. All those taken up for riot the previous evening were now being held within its walls, and so the intention was clearly to rescue them from it. So a relatively small number, equipped with iron bars and hammers, marched on the prison to force a release. Now, Bridewell Lane could itself be closed off by means of 2 sets of heavy wooden gates illustrated here. So, well, they're either side. You saw them on the other map. They're either side of the wall. That Sunday, it was left to the governor, the taskmaster, and the turnkey to secure these gates as the crowd got closer to them. But they were easily overwhelmed. The gates unhinged and thrown into the river. After that, there was little the governor could do but surrender the keys. So within minutes, all the prisoners were released and the building was fired, probably to prevent its reuse. Now, leaving Bridewell, voices in the crowd were heard shouting, "Now for the new jail." Let's be quite clear. There were no riot prisoners being held there that day, and nor would anyone have expected there to be. It was a much more formidable objective than Bridewell. It had no obvious connection to the protest over the Reform Bill, So it wasn't perhaps the most obvious of targets in a reform riot. There goes my clock. We're halfway through. The crowd now marched to the new jail, but by a slightly odd route. So I thought I'd just illustrate it on this map. They turned left up Broad Street. You can see that here. Whoa, go away. They turned left to go up Broad Street, as you see here. This was partly, I think, so that they could quickly liberate the Tailors' Court debtors lockup. I've marked that in green for you. Another place, incidentally, with no obvious connection to the Reform Bill. But also, perhaps, because I mean, this is guesswork, but why not? Perhaps because it enabled them to parade in triumph past both the Guildhall and the Council House. I've ringed those in blue. Then, turning sharply to the right by way of Corn Street, Clare Street, straight to the quay, along it, and then, yeah, over Princes Street Bridge to the new jail. Some commentators felt the jail should have been strong enough to look after itself. At first, it was supposed that the designs of the mob on the jail were altogether futile, wrote the editor of the Bristol Mercury, William Somerton. No one imagined that so strong and apparently so inaccessible a place could possibly be forced by them. And the Attorney General added his agreement. I say that, and now my screen won't let me move my slides. Help. There we are. The Attorney General says there never was a place which presented a more complete front to the enemy. The walls are very powerful and the approach extremely difficult. The doors are strong and the entrance extremely narrow in front of the jail. There never was a place which admitted of more easy defence than this jail. Now, what did they mean by inaccessible and the approach was extremely difficult? I mean, what does that mean? Why was it? Well, look, the jail was built upon an island that could quite easily be separated from the rest of the city by swinging the Princes Street Bridge at the top of the map there, and the two smaller bridges, ringed in blue, across the Bathurst Basin. But it wasn't done. The crowd descending on the prison was vast, far greater than the crowd that attacked Bridewell. Somewhere between 12 and 15,000 people, according to most estimates. There's very little disagreement about the size of the crowd by the time they reached the jail. Most of them remained on the far side of the new cut, other side of the water, and were presumed by most observers to be watching rather than acting, but up to about 1,000 people were believed to be on the island. Now, after 45 minutes labour with sledgehammers and wedges, a hole was made in the outer wooden doors of the gatehouse large enough for a man to crawl through to release the bolts on the inner iron gates. So they were released and the crowd ran in. William Humphreys, I've just put a little red ring on there to show you where that was. William Humphreys, he's the prison governor, his house was encountered and sacked by the crowd first. His personal belongings, his furniture, his books, his prison supplies, some prison equipment, dried food, for example, prison bedding, prison uniforms were thrown into the waters of the Cut, together with the prison caravan used for conveying prisoners to and from the courthouse, and the gallows apparatus stored for use on the roof. And when that was done, the house was set on fire. Now, why did the crowd start with the governor's house? They didn't have to. They could have run straight off to release all the prisoners. Well, Humphrey's house was the jail's nerve centre, hub from which a small group of prison managers could simultaneously see into the corridors and yards of all 4 wings, while at the same time observing anyone coming or going through the main gate. So in other words, the building's destruction severely compromised the entire radial system. It's actually quite an intelligent target. As we see in this contemporary watercolour, the damage was pretty extensive, and the length of time it took to rebuild it in the aftermath of the riots was a worry to some. As the mayor wrote to the Home Secretary the next year, "It's been reported to me that until the house is rebuilt, the governor cannot have that entire review of the different parts of the prison which he previously had, and which is desirable for the complete superintendence and control over the prison." The iron doors to the 4 wings of the prison, the radial wings, were then sledgehammered open. All the prisoners were released, women first, and then the men. As one eyewitness report had it, the scenes which followed were beyond description. Many of them, both male and female, stripped off their clothes and proceeded, oh dear, they're not going to get caught after all. Stripped off their clothes and proceeded on their way almost in a state of nudity. As they passed along, the mob cheered them and followed after them with exultations. Many of them met with their friends on the outside, and it's not easy to depict the extravagant joy with which they mutually embraced each other. Now, I put this picture in here simply because it's the only one I've found, and it is a little blurred, so I'm sorry about that, but it's the only one I've found. If you look carefully, you can see prisoners having their leg irons removed by their friends kneeling at their feet. It's the only one I think that actually depicts the release of the prisoners out into the city. Next, it was the turn of the treadmill. That too, of course, was broken up and set on fire, and all these fires were applauded by the crowd outside over the water. William Somerton commented on it. "Up to this period, it must not be denied," he wrote, "a strong prejudice was in full operation among the majority of spectators in favour of the rioters." And the Reverend John Eagles chimed in with, "If so dense a mass as that here collected were not all rioters, shouts of encouragement were too loud to be mistaken," and indicated citizen population willing and rejoicing that the King's jail should be burned. The cries of "the King and reform" were the common passwords used alike for both triumph and security. Some actions were more symbolic than tactical. A makeshift black flag was run up the gatehouse weather vane to further cheering. Humphrey's larder was raided for edible trophies. A dish of the governor's bacon was paraded at a hostelry that evening, fried in a pan with some bread, which, noted the landlord, they were happy to pay for, and given out to passers-by, quote, "as a curiosity," one of them said, in a sort of impromptu barbecue. "The governor keeps damn fine bacon," one man was heard to say. Now, what, if anything, did all this have to do with the politics of reform? I mean, clearly very few of the men and women taking part in either the protests against Wetherell or the sacking of the jail stood to gain very much in direct terms from the passing of the Reform Bill. It wasn't going to enfranchise them. They may have seen it, I guess, as gateway legislation, should we call it that? You know, by widening the franchise to include the propertied middle class, it may have followed in theory that the aristocratic stranglehold Parliament would be broken. Legislation favouring lower class families would perhaps follow, paving the way for further extensions of the suffrage in due course, perhaps. Evidence of motivation is really rather difficult to gather some 200 years after the event. You know, arrested rioters were never asked to explain their motivation. or discuss their worldview. And they were not great letter writers or diarists either. But contemporary reportage records a ready use of what I think we might call a loose language of reform. I saw Moss take up what appeared to be a linen sheet and throw it into the fire, and he shouted, "Here goes, reform!" One trial witness. It was also the moment when Christopher Davis, one of those subsequently hanged for his part in the riots, was seen waving his hat on top of his umbrella and shouting, "Now, damn you, we will have reform." This is what ought to have been done years ago. Reform was a much used term in the early 19th century, a byword, not just for franchise extension, but for social and economic improvement, for progressive change in the abstract. Everyone was interested in reform. It was as malleable and abstract a term as liberty had been in reforming circles since at least the 18th century. In fact, it was Bill Clark who was heard to shout, "We shall have liberty," as the crowd advanced on the new jail. A term in his mouth, both literal and figurative, in the context happened next. And it was Clark who proudly held up the prison keys later that evening before an admiring audience and announced that within a fortnight he would have all the prisons in England opened. So, the attack on the new jail is perhaps not best understood as a departure from the reforming agenda, but a widening of its terms of reference, by which reforming the newfangled penal regime of incarceration and unproductive enforced labour was at least as pressing as the reorganisation of Parliament. Members of the pro-reform but respectable political union found, when they tried to persuade the crowd inside the burning jail to disperse, the selection of targets was no longer governed by direct association with Wetherell or the Reform Bill, but by a much broader agenda. The crowd were willing to listen, reported the political union's negotiators, but they would, quote, "not be diverted from their purpose," which they said was to ransack the banks and destroy the dock gates, saying that since the erection of the gates, labour had become more scarce and wages had been lowered. So the development of political, social, and economic objectives like these really ought to alert us to things the crowd didn't do during the first 24 hours of activity. You know, this was not yet an acquisitive riot. In other words, prison property was destroyed, but little of it was stolen. Other than running off with some prison bedding, this was a crowd with no inclination for looting. And except in self-defense, one or two instances of score settling with prison turnkeys, little desire for violent physical confrontations with their opponents. So how should we regard the freeing of an entire prison population on this occasion? What does it say about the crowd? Or as one horrified, quote, "friend of the labouring classes," unquote, expressed it, "what must the men be, and what their object, who to procure agents and associates empty the common jails?" There are no surviving jail registers for these years, and no official lists of escapees were ever published. But we can be reasonably sure who a lot of them were by checking the records of the Quarter Session Court over the course of the previous year, because that way we can see who was awarded a prison sentence and who should have been in the prison. Now, the total number thought to have escaped at that time was 176. That's if we include the debtors, or about 100 if we count only the felons. And by this means, we can name 99 liberated prisoners on the felons' side. I won't try to name them all now, we haven't got time, but I'll carve them up for you. So we're looking therefore at 15 men awaiting transportation, 1 woman awaiting transportation. So they've already been sentenced, but they're waiting to be put on a hulk. 69 men serving jail terms or awaiting trial, and 14 women serving jail terms or awaiting trial. If we look into their cases, we find the majority of the released prisoners were serving relatively short jail sentences of between 3 and 12 months for minor acts of theft. You know, regardless of the new regime of corrective punishment, longer sentences remained extremely unusual in 1831. 6 of the total number were serving sentences of 18 months. One other, 27-year-old Amy Thomas, was serving a 2-year sentence for concealing the death of an illegitimate baby. 2 of the men were serving short sentences for assault, 2 more for receiving stolen goods, 1 for passing counterfeit coins, and 1 woman, Mary Banks, had been fined and jailed for keeping a bawdy house, but the rest were petty thieves. Like many of the men and women now setting them free then, most had been casual workers. That is, before they were apprehended. People who scratched a living on the margins of the city's economy. 1 or 2 do have traceable stories. Martha O'Brien, for instance, was a poor, out-of-place domestic servant, a charwoman, awaiting trial for stealing goods from a Broad Street grocery shop. She was committed to the jail for the coming October assize, but released back into the city by the crowd before court. She made it all the way to London. She married a man there, but was finally recognised in May 1832, dragged back to Bristol, put into the courthouse and transported to life. Most of them had been jailed for pilfering single items for personal use rather than for profit. 17-year-old Charles Walker, for instance, was awaiting transportation after being caught raiding a gentleman's larder for meat. And another man, also a youth, was serving 4 months for snatching a few bottles of beer from a brewer's cart. Young men like these can hardly be described as professional criminals. And most of them were young. Of the 56 escapees whose ages are recorded, 42 were aged between 12 and 22, with the largest cluster, 26 prisoners in all, aged between 15 and 18. You know, perhaps the most tenacious of them was 14-year-old George Edwards, rearrested at Birmingham in August 1832 for picking pockets. His previous form at Worcester and Coventry, as well as at Bristol, Edwards cut a most unsympathetic figure in the dock and was accordingly transported for 14 years. Going someone such tender age. Thank you, my lord, and long live the king, he is alleged to have declared as they took him down. The 2 youngest escapees were just 12 years old. John Facey had been sentenced to 7 years transportation, pilfering felt, no he hadn't, sorry, 7 years transportation at the October sessions, shortly before the riots began. What had he done? Grabbed a purse in Redcliffe Street. Henry Hicks, he'd been jailed for 6 months for stealing a cheese. Some of the escapees gave themselves up at the first opportunity. William England, in awaiting transportation, for pilfering felt and glue from his employer's hat work, but had on all accounts been an exemplary prisoner before being sprung by the crowd, and hoping his previous good conduct would earn him a reprieve, England offered himself back to the authorities almost immediately, and his wife then petitioned for clemency. It's quite interesting, the petition has survived, and it's annotated, quote, liberated from jail by the mob, but afterwards surrendered himself. Paid off, actually. England was the only prospective transportee to have his original sentence reduced to imprisonment. Although about 2/3 of the escapees either surrendered themselves, like William England, or were recaptured within a week, 8 transportees and 22 convicts serving prison terms were still at large as the year turned, and at least 5 of the transportees appear never to have been retaken. Well, let's turn to some concluding remarks. Attack on Bristol Gaol remains one of only a small number of 18th and 19th century attempts on well-built British. And aside from the well-known attack on London's Newgate prison during the Gordon riots 50 years earlier, aside from that, surely the most sensitive. With the exception of one other reform-related prison attack at Derby earlier in October, the few other examples we might name, and I will name Greenock in Scotland in 1820, Dover in 1820, where the intention was to release some smugglers. At Greenock, it was an attempt to release political radicals involved in the Scottish insurrection of that year. At Poole on the Isle of Man in 1821, where the intention was to release a food rioter. And at Rochdale in 1829, where the intention was to release some people arrested and imprisoned for trades union activity in the middle of two bitter strikes. You know where this is going. These were all rescue efforts in which no attempt was made at a general prisoner release. And apart from London's Newgate, none of these buildings was of comparable size or defensive design to the new jail. Let's go back to this marvelous picture. Over the previous 10 years, Bristolians will have been aware not only of the new jail's bulky intrusion into the spatial topography of the city, but of the popularity of its new styled corrective regime amongst the city's magistrates. Whereas in the years before its construction, transportation had accounted for a greater number of sentences than imprisonment, the opposite was true after 1820, when this building was erected. While transportation physically removed convicts far from the influence of friends and families, the jail kept them close at hand, but screened by a seemingly impregnable 20 wall. Writing about London's Gordon riots in 1718, Tim Hitchcock and Bob Shoemaker have identified what they call, quote, a powerful hostility towards criminal justice and its institutions, and not simply those which contained prisoners arrested in the riots. Indeed, only 3 captured rioters were being held at London's Newgate when it was attacked and delivered. They conclude, we should not underestimate the profound significance of these assaults on the prisons, or the extent to which they heralded a desperate, if inchoate, revolutionary moment. Well, Bristol in 1831 wasn't London in 1780. London's prisons were filthy and overcrowded, a situation exacerbated by the forced curtailment of transportation to America during the American War of Independence. In the 1820s, Bristol's courts could choose either imprisonment or transportation as punishments, felony, but usually adopted for the latter only where magistrates felt an example needed to be made, or because the prisoner had been convicted of a second offence. In other words, people sent for transportation don't imagine they'd committed worse crimes. They hadn't, and they were often simply second offenders. The jail was full in 1831, but not overcrowded. The diet, while not particularly nutritious, was better than it had been at the old jail, and the building was relatively airy and clean. However, the physical and mental strain imposed on prisoners by the treadmill on the one hand, and new regimes of constant surveillance and non-associative discipline on the other, will surely have left its mark on attitudes to the criminal justice system amongst the city's labouring poor. It's worth remembering, moreover, that the riots began as a protest not just against an anti-reformer, but against an anti-reformer, Charles Weathering, who also just happens to be the city recorder, chief judge, in other words, the most important and powerful representative of the city's judicial framework. The crowd's first action was perhaps inadvertently to cause the cancellation of the official jail delivery. A court with capital jurisdiction, presided over by the recorder, and which twice yearly sent convicts to the new jail. Hostility to anti-reformers in Parliament had become inextricably entangled with hostility towards criminal justice and its institutions, Bristol at least. You know, through objections to the central figure of Sir Charles Wetherell. While it would be stretching the evidence to call the Bristol riots an inchoate revolutionary moment, the liberation and burning of the jail makes little sense in the context either of a literally understood, form riot. It's not a very helpful term, is it? Or as a meaningless outburst of collective violence. What we can say, however, I think, is that the delivery of the jail was an extraordinary and transformative moment, a central act in 3 days of destructive activity. Began as a window-breaking protest against the recorder, but finished with the firing of private housing and a most dreadful massacre at the hands of the military. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Steve. Absolutely fascinating talk, and we've got quite a few questions coming in. So I'm not going to do the whole chair's prerogative thing yet. We'll actually get to our audience questions, and then I can keep bothering you about these things when we're at work. Anyway, so to begin with, Richard wanted to know what were the different penal classes that you mentioned?
Well, there were 10 of them, and I can't reel them off the top of my head, but they were yeah, I mean, the intention was not just to separate people by age and by gender, but to separate them by scales of criminality, imaginary scales of criminality, I suppose. So the idea was, as I said to you before, one of the problems with Newgate was it was assumed to be a sort of nursery of crime. You let everybody indiscriminately and promiscuously mix within the walls of a prison. All that's going to happen is that the young criminals will learn tricks from the old criminals. So it was, and people, are convicted of moral crimes like running a brothel or something. Let's not have them mixing with young people, particularly young girls. So that was the principle. I do have a note somewhere of what all the classes were, but I cannot reel them off. But you just need to know what the principle was, I think.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and it's, as you say, so different to the older jails in the city as well. We've got a couple of sort of observations, but I think it'd be interesting to have your reflections on them as well here from Heather, who noted that it seems that most prisoners were poor and stealing. So they've suggested perhaps is that because, they're starving or that they need more to eat. And Heather also notes that the layout of the prison, of the new jail, is really similar to some workhouses.
Oh yes, well, the common denominator is surveillance, I suppose. We didn't have a treadmill in the workhouse or a gallows erected over the gatehouse, but yes, I know these are fair observations, I think. Yeah, what was the first one? Poverty.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, I agree. I mean, I don't think we have to assume anyone was necessarily starving, but I mean, look, you don't risk incarceration or possible transportation by stealing cheese unless you're pretty bloody hungry at best. I mean, I think that their statistics speak for themselves. As I said, most of the people accused of robberies, or well, they're not robberies, they're thefts. They're not confrontational thievings generally. Most of them have stolen a single item or one or two small items. And the risks are too high to just think, oh, I tell you what, I'll pick that up and take it away. I'll probably get away with it. You wouldn't do it unless you needed to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an interesting thing, isn't it, Steve, that it's not always that sort of theft sort of directly of, you're starving and you steal food, but these are things that have value that you might be able to fence, that it might be about feeding yourself, but also supporting your household income, that kind of idea of, opportunism and I suppose an economy of makeshifts as well.
Yeah, but there are a large number of pickpockets, for example, who are not looking for fence. They're simply looking to enrich themselves by some small means, whatever. People who, the kid who stole 4 bottles of beer. I mean, he might have wanted to sell 3 and drink 1. I don't know, but there's one. I don't,
Yeah.
I mean, if you could take something and shift it off up to somewhere in the Pit-Hay Rag Fair or something, perhaps you would. But not too many people in there for receiving. Interestingly.
Yeah. Right. So there's a question here from Nigel. He says that they've read that the governor made a claim for his belongings lost in the riots, but he was never paid out, or claims never paid out, and was deemed fraudulent. Do you know anything about that?
No, I don't know. Is that true that it was never paid out? I'm surprised that it wasn't paid out. There's a strange issue around paying out on occasions like this. In order for anyone who's had their property damaged during a riot, it was necessary, if they wanted to reclaim the full value of the goods lost, it was necessary for them to find somebody who they could put into court and accuse of the capital felony of attempting to destroy the house. Courts wouldn't recognize the breaking of windows and shuttering and a couple of doors as an attempt to destroy the house. So you get quite a lot of court cases sort of hinging on attempts by the prosecution to show that although the house wasn't actually destroyed, it was quite clear there was a felonious intent so to do. And you'll see crowds actually behaving quite smartly around that law too. I mean, I think one of the reasons that that reform crowds generally started and ended, I mean, Bristol's an exception, but riots started and ended with the breaking of windows, was that this was a pretty minor affair. You get caught breaking windows. If you go in and set fire to a building, then you are definitely trying to destroy it. So I wouldn't have thought there'd be any problem arguing that the governor's house had indeed been, there'd been an attempt to destroy it. But I don't know. I'll look into that. I haven't really got to the claims for compensation yet. That's another whole business, isn't it? But we'll get there.
Yeah, I was quite struck actually, because I think Humphreys has been the by 1831, Humphreys was certainly, I think, the governor in 1821 as well. So he's obviously long-serving, first governor, perhaps. Yeah, in this.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. We have got another couple of questions, but kind of going on off the top of that last one, I was quite interested in, the sort of how the local authorities justified their, failure around the defence of the jail. And yeah.
The mayor, the mayor is put on trial ultimately for negligence the state wanted to, and central state wanted to hammer the Bristol magistrates for incompetence and misjudgment. He was acquitted, and he argued it wasn't his fault. I mean, it was. It's a very complicated thing, I think, as to who was responsible for letting it get out of hand. There were all kinds of these sort of epic moments where key decisions have to be made. There's the moment where, after special constables have been set upon the crowd, disperse them outside the Mansion House on the first afternoon, and they beat the crowd quite mercilessly. And the crowd are therefore, pretty angry and ready for action. The mayor and magistrates call in the troops. The soldiers arrive, and the commander of the soldiers, Colonel Brereton, makes the decision that actually I'm not going to send troops in here. It will exacerbate the problem, make things worse. Later on, troops do indeed shoot 3 members of the crowd dead, and this is before things have got particularly out of hand. That's just on the first night and then the following morning. And the military commander then makes the decision to remove the soldiers from Bristol and send them to Keynsham, where they can't cause any more trouble. I mean, that's a difficult call. If you keep the soldiers there, they could with force, with force of arms, prevent the riots becoming any more serious than they currently are.
Mm.
But on the other hand, you might make the riots worse by angering the crowd. And you have to make these decisions. And he made the decision to send the troops away. I think in retrospect, he probably would have said, well, things did get pretty serious after that, and we couldn't defend jails, for example.
Thank you, Steve. Right, we'll return to our audience questions now as well. We have one here from Cleo who says, great presentation. Can you explain what you mean by transportation? Were prisoners actually shipped anywhere? And do we know if there were any Black or African heritage people in the prison at the time? The treadmill was new information for them.
Right, well, I haven't found any Black prisoners, which isn't to say there weren't any, because as I said, there's no prison registers, and what evidence we do have doesn't always name place of origin or even place of abode. So that's tricky. Don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if there were, but we don't know. Transportation, yes, they were packed onto boats and sent to Van Diemen's Land or Australia. These rioters were sent to Van Diemen's Land. They were usually sentenced to work for local employers, farmers or whatever, for 7 years, 14 years, or for life, depending on the severity of the sentence.
Do we know if any of those sent returned, Steve, actually?
Well, I don't know, actually. No, I don't. It's quite easy to record what happens to many of them when they get there, because prison, that's when the convict registers suddenly kick in, and we can learn all about their misbehaviour and their tickets of leave and their their extra convictions from insubordination or whatever. There are some tragic tales. One of those 12-year-old boys, for example, that I mentioned, were the two youngest people to be released from the prison. When he was recaptured, the guy who just stole the cheese, actually, when he was recaptured, he was sent to Van Diemen's Land, where he spent. He disappears from the record in 1859. He spent, all those years, 40 odd years, in constant conflict with institutional justice, either in Bristol or in Van Diemen's Land. He's the list of misdemeanors and offences that he commits once he's over there. It's just endless. Every so often he's told, well, we're going to give you a pardon, and then he commits another offence, and then he gets another 4 years. Yeah, multiply whipped, and just awful, actually. Some of these kids.
Yeah, no, I think, and it's the conduct records for those sorts of things. Quite often, the offences that they're done for, they're things like disobedience, negligence of work, being rude to their masters. But you can just imagine, as you implied, that someone, particularly in those formative years, who's just constantly being met with this kind of extraordinary repression, is not going to stop, bucking against it, or is just going to be so damaged by that experience. Yeah. That's awful. I didn't realise 12 recaptured and then transported. That's
basically, yes.
Wow. So I've got a question here from Jemima as well. Did anyone die in the fire?
At the prison? No. No, things were set on fire. I mean, everyone was released from the cell wings, before anything was set on fire. But I don't think the crowd had any intention of killing anybody, but people did die in fires during the Bristol riots. But they died in fires partly because the military adopted a tactic on the final day of chasing people into burning buildings and not letting them out. So untold numbers of people did actually burn to death. Some, of course, by misadventure while they were in there trying to set fires. Quite a number as a result of military intervention.
We've got one other question here from Susan, who would like to know where the paintings shown in the paintings shown in the tour car.
Oh yeah. So we're so fortunate that in Bristol, the City Museum and Art Gallery and the library between them have a huge number of images made by artists who went out at night making sketches. You know, so William Muller, Thomas Rowbottom, James Barker Pine, William Wheatley. The images I was showing, I should have put the labels on them already to tell you who'd made them and where they are, but they all reside in the city pretty much, in either in the Museum and Art Gallery, or maybe there are some in the M Shed at the moment. I'm not familiar. Are you on show in the M Shed? No. Yeah, there is perhaps one. But we have a lot of them anyway, and yeah, it's a fantastic resource.
Yeah. We've got another question just slid in here from Paul. How long before the jails were rebuilt and in use again?
Oh, so yeah, that's a good one. The Bridewell was never rebuilt and reused. I mean, it was a medieval sort of arcade, you know. There was talk of rebuilding Bridewell, you know, sort of on a patch of ground next to the new jail. I don't think it obviously never actually happened. But the main concern was getting the new jail back together again, the big jail, because they had to have somewhere. They'd arrested somewhere in the region of 85 people during the 3 days of Bristol riots. They had to put them somewhere. And what the rioters had rather cleverly done was destroy all the prisons where they could potentially be held awaiting trial. So they did manage to hold them in the new jail. I mean, it wasn't substantially destroyed. Lawford's Gate was, well, that was rebuilt. Yeah, but the new jail wasn't. I mean, as a governor's house was the main problem. That had to be completely reconstructed, and they built a chapel separately, ultimately between two of the wings, so it wasn't above the governor's house any longer. But they were able to reuse the new jail actually within weeks of the riots ending. You know, the special commission that came to try the rioters was held in January 1832, and all the prisoners were held in what was left of the new jail prior to that. So they were they did work pretty hard on getting it.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to give our brilliant audience like one more opportunity to chuck a question in the Q&A, if you can cope with it, Steve, and I'm going to ask one in the meantime, if that's okay. I was really struck, and I kind of feel daft for not thinking about this sooner, actually, when you're talking about the fires, and we've got these amazing images of incendiarism, but that's very much to do with the destruction of the prison sites and things like that. And I know from some of my own work that when you're prosecuting people for riot, you don't necessarily construct the charge around riot. You construct it around other associated offences to make it a much more effective prosecution. Was arson used to kind of secure prosecutions against rioters?
I don't think anyone they don't use the specific arson law, but attempting to pull down the jail, for example, that's capital. There are plenty of capital offences that they use. I mean, riot itself, of course, is really just a bit of a misdemeanor. It's like breaking the peace. It's like shouting too loudly in a built-up area or something. It's not just running around and causing mayhem. Was sort of this Friday night activity. Doesn't carry a big enough sentence. So what you had to do was to associate it with attempting to destroy a private or public building, or capital theft. You know, so you, as long as something was stolen. I mean, a large number of people arrested at the time of the Bristol riots were arrested for picking things up off the ground, which had come from buildings that had been sacked.
Yeah.
But they're, of course, accused of theft, not riot.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. I just noted that, you know, on the image you showed of the woodcut image of the execution, and it sort of says riot and arson, because I suppose they're popularly
that's true.
the crimes, but they're not necessarily what's legally used to get them, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I don't think because people are accused on a number of counts, aren't they? And so there will be a count of simple riot in there, as well as, you know. So you build basically build up a charge with about 12 clauses on it, and you know you're going to get them on each one of those.
Yeah.
But it starts with, if you can't get them on the big one, you get them on the lower.
Yeah, you keep going until you've absolutely.
You'll have them for something.
Yeah, no, I've seen exactly the same in other contexts as well. So we've got Heather has managed to sneak one in just before the end there. Heather was wondering whether ancestors living in the immediate area saw this event. I mean, it's perhaps more of a reflection on Heather's ancestors. But just I mean, is there popular commentary on this? You know, I mean,
I know some
people gathering to look at this. Could we decipher from the crowd?
Yeah, I know there was an attempt. One of the local history groups, I think, did try to find out a little bit about sort of criminal ancestors related to the Bristol riots. I don't think they got anywhere. I may be wrong about that. We'd love to know if they did. I can tell you that in Blandford Forum, where there was another reform riot, which we have investigated, one of the people transported there, Richard Lethman, capitally convicted and then transported Van Diemen's Land. His descendants are still there, and we've been in touch with them, and we've had video messaging and things going on with them and everything. Interestingly, you know, they're very, very proud of their rioting ancestor because they see. Well, I think it's partly, you know, if you've grown up in you know, Tasmania or Australia to that extent, you know, that what they used to call the stain. Sort of hung over so many families. The idea that, oh, we're only here because we're the descendants of convicts. So thanks very much. You know, cutthroats, thieves, and murderers. Well, thank you. But if you find that your descendant was actually somebody who rioted for the democratic imperative, you know, or for the democratic state, in some senses, someone who had no good luck. And rioted for something vaguely progressive, then of course you're proud of it, I suppose, and it's perhaps not entirely surprising. So they are, I can tell you that.
Yeah. Right. We've got 2 more questions. Can you cope with 2, Steve? And then I promise that you can have your tea. Right. So Stacey asked if you could possibly show the treadmill slide again.
Oh, yes, I can. If my slides will move. Yeah, here we go. There it is.
Thank you very much. And we have another question here.
Was that it? Was that it?
I think that was literally that was a request. That was a request. So
yeah, okay.
I take it that's not the treadmill that was at Bristol New Jail. I take it that's a
no. That's a treadmill illustration produced in about 1809, I think, because it's from Ackerman's print repository I see in London.
Yeah.
That would be a contemporary.
Yeah.
Similar. Yeah. You know, one of the things about the treadmill was that, you know, you think, well, they must have died of boredom. No, they didn't die of boredom. They died of exhaustion, and the reason for that was that the prison governor could dictate how much resistance there was in the wheel. So they were very adjustable. So if you wanted to give people a really bad time, then you could. And you could just tighten the resistance, and then they had to work really hard to make the thing go. And you could just imagine how bloody exhausting that was.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. I mean, certainly when I've looked at other sort of equivalent jails, Dorchester Jail, where I think some of the guys from Blandford Forum would have been held. The treadwheel there, which was another 1820s one, even though the jail is slightly older. Yeah, that was in operation 10 hours a day. That, you know, for work.
Yeah.
Extraordinary.
It doesn't stop, and it's completely pointless most of the time. One or two of them circulate water or air or something, you know, but even one I think could grind corn. But basically, you know, most of that was completely unproductive labour. What sort of lessons it was supposed to teach are anybody's guess.
Yeah, exactly, Steve.
Service, I suppose, was the main one.
Yeah. So our last question, I think, so we can give you a rest, from Richard here. So rather than storming the building to liberate individuals, this was a sort of symbolic building, symbolic building like storming the Bastille. So that's the sort of observation I think that Richard's making. Was that shared by the crowd in speeches, pamphlets, etc.?
The most annoying thing about trying to do history from below is that no one ever asks members of the crowd what they think, and no one cares. They just want to punish them. You know, they're a nuisance and they have to be dealt with. That's why I made something of you know, where it's been recorded that a member of the crowd shouted the word reform or talked about liberty. When they use that, sometimes they use it jokingly. There was an instance in Queen Square where one rioter is seen carrying a mahogany table across the lawn. It's obviously come out of a house. And someone goes up to him and says, "Is that a reform table you've got there?" And the guy goes, "Yes, absolutely, definitely a reform table." And he says, "Then you may come past." And they all have a good laugh about it because it's become a reform table or a reformed table. I mean, they don't, you know, there are serious sides to this, but they're not, you know, they don't publish manifestos. It's not a revolutionary moment in the sense that there's government in waiting, a committee of public safety waiting around the corner to leap in. Although, of course, you know, one might ask questions like, well, after the jails have been fired, and therefore we seem to have moved into a slightly different area in terms of intention, and after that, you know, two sides of Queen Square are burned down, private residences, and the custom house is destroyed, and the poll house is destroyed, and the bishop's palace is destroyed. If the military hadn't, I mean, there's a terrible massacre on the final morning as the 3rd Dragoon Guards sweep through Queen Square, hacking at anyone still out, you know, and then run on through up Welshback and through the town. Hundreds of people are slaughtered. But if the military hadn't done that, big counterfactual question, isn't it? What would have happened next?
Yeah.
You know, would they have turned on the banks? Would they have turned on the chimney? Would you know?
Yeah.
You can only guess.
Yeah.
Would they have set up a provisional government? I don't know. Yeah. I don't think there was one waiting in the wings.
The provisional government of independent Bristol. I quite like the idea of that. And also, I suppose it's worth pointing out, and do correct me if I'm wrong, that, you know, the rioters that are killed and the people who killed them, whether they're troops or, you know, civil forces or whatever, they're all indemnified because of the context of riot suppression and law enforcement. Those people aside, obviously we talked about the magistrates' incompetence and Brereton's, you know, apparent negligence, but in terms of actually sort of, physically stopping rioters or killing them, they're not prosecuted.
Who? Sorry.
The authorities of, you know, the military who kill rioters or
no, they're indemnified by the reading of the Riot Act, so they get away with it. I guess, I mean, it's basically Brereton was put on trial. He's court-martialed, and such is the shame of his exposure that before it comes to an end, he takes a gun to his own head and blows his brains out. Tragic, actually, really. Yeah. So he and the mayor are the only two people who are brought up for, you know, failure of duty.
I think it's so extraordinary, particularly in this context of thinking about criminal justice and the kind of literal shadow of it in the, you know, in the way it's sort of the inequities of its operation in this context. Yes. Because I was waffling at you, Caroline has snuck one question in. Will you take it or? Yeah. So Caroline asked, the riot seemed very organised. Were Chartists involved?
Because, well, technically, no. I mean, you know, it depends. I mean, technically, the answer to that is no, they can't have been, because the People's Charter was published in 1838 and it was 1831. But there weren't any Chartists. But, I mean, what you're really asking is whether there were politically motivated working class people involved in the crowd. I would say almost certainly were. But we come back to, what did they say? What did they write? Did they publish a pamphlet? No, they didn't. So, the likelihood that no one in there had a political objection beyond, the failure of the Lords to pass the Reform Act because it's pretty slender, isn't it? I mean, but then, no, there's no formal organisation. The National Union of the Working Classes is active, and because the odd thing about them is they're a universal suffragist organisation, like the Chartists, 7 years later. But their position, of course, is that they don't want the reform. They want a proper universal suffrage measure brought in. These are the people associated with Henry Hunt, the hero of Peterloo. They were universal suffragists. They didn't want they weren't going to have the wool pulled over their eyes around, oh, well, if we give the vote to middle class men, then that's a staging post, the enfranchisement of everybody else. They just said, no, there's no way. That's not going to happen. And they weren't entirely wrong.
Yeah, no, indeed. Yeah. Well, look, we must stop now, Steve, because we've been quizzing you for a good 25 minutes as well. But thank you enormously again for a fantastic talk. Before everybody dashes off, I was very remiss because I forgot to promote this at the beginning. Bad Blood in Georgian Bristol. This is Steve's latest book, and it is part of our Redcliffe Regional History Centre series at UWE, produced with Redcliffe Press. And it's about the murder of Sir John Dineley. I assume I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's also incredibly reasonably priced, as well as beautifully researched, and an amazing present for Christmas. I'm sure that's what everybody is putting on their lists right now. But yeah, it's also available, I believe, at a discounted rate for Regional History Centre members as well. So
it certainly will be.
It certainly will be. There we go. Good news.
We're waiting for deliveries or something.
And finally, to remind you all that we'll be back next month on the 15th of December for a talk by another fabulous UWE colleague, Dr. Chad Staton, who is going to be talking about muck and modernity, 19th century sewerage engineering and the growth of modern Bristol. So a different form of history from below, perhaps. That was a really bad joke. Apologies. But thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you again, Steve, for a fascinating talk. And we look forward to seeing you all here next month. Thanks very much.